Now the book, being different, as I see it, identifies India as a unique civilization. It offers a redressal or a corrective to the historical misunderstanding about India by the West, which we have uncritically digested, assimilated in deep structures of our psyche. In a thoughtful, thought-provoking exposition, the author identifies a set of conceptual blind spots and areas of cognitive dissonance between the dharmic traditions in the East and the monolithic religions of the West. His approach, as I see it, is to distinguish between different layers of ideological frames and foundational principles of Indic dharma that have given the Indic civilization its unique pluralistic identity. Now, what is presented in the book then is what I may call as a diagnosis of difference. And when I read through the chapters, for me the book is really not about universalism, but using the idea of universalism as a lens to heighten the difference between the East and the West. How the East defines itself, how the West tends to negate those interpretations by framing their discourses in terms of the history-centric Judeo-Christian faith. In outlining the essential differences between East and West, as it were, of course, as he himself explained, he reverses the gaze, where the observed takes the position of the observer. He addresses several philosophical categories that define Indic identity. In attempting a critical hermeneutics of discernment, cultural differences is thematized in 5 self-contained chapters, and he did explain those very well. Now I think that in order to understand why there is difference between the East and the West, we have to look deeply into the nature of Hindu faith. And I think if we understand the very nature of what we call Indic civilization and Hinduism, we will be able to decode the differences. Now, in contrast to the Bible, which is the main scripture of the Judeo-Christian faith, the Rig Veda, which is regarded as a legacy of the whole Indic civilization, is looked upon as a foundational text of Indic culture. The Veda is said to be apaurushaya, which is what it means is that it is not an artifact, a literary artifact written by a person. It was revealed to the sages or rishis who saw the truth in their contemplation. And Yasaka gives a wonderful, in his lexicon, gives a wonderful description of rishis. Who is a rishi? Rishi is mantra dishtaha. That means those who see the mantras, those who have an intuitive perception to absorb revealed knowledge. So Vedic revelation is not a voice of a human revealer. It is regarded as a shruti, that which is heard and orally transmitted. Orality for the Hindu traditions preserves the certitude of meaning. In Western view, orality is opposed to the certitude of words, because it is the sacred book which is the final source of authority. So I think this is the crux, this is one of the major differences between the Eastern view and the Western view. Now, secondly, the Hindu tradition, while presenting several parallels to other great religions, cannot be compared. And that has so much to do with its history as it is the way it is conceived. It is not a religion of one book, but a process, a way of life, where competing claims have found an honorable place. It is often acknowledged that nothing can be asserted about Hinduism that cannot be denied. In practical terms, it means 2 counter-ideologies may exist side by side, and the 2 ideologies may coalesce to create a 3rd ideology. Hindu faith works its way intrinsically through decentralized structures. Its distinguishing feature is that its widely divergent form of religiosity exists in innumerable combinations within its vast social fabric. So, and this has been in some form or the other approved, defended, prescribed, and standardized by the often conflicting or contesting sources of authority. It has been acknowledged that Hindu faith cannot be regarded as a variant of Western religion. And I think that is what Rajiv is telling us again and again in the book. You know, what he does is to look at several mainstream concepts, and he gets back to the original that, look, we have an indigenous viewpoint and we should preserve that. Because it is woven in the very structure of Hindu thinking. Hindu thinking is different from the monotheistic religion of Semitic traditions. While Hinduism does not fit into the frame of Western idiom, some aspects of Hinduism, however, are expansive enough to assimilate several contrasting forms of knowledge systems. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this idea, because the idea of difference and diversity is, as I said, is in the DNA of our civilization. And our sages and our rishis and our thinkers had to cope with that difference and distinction. So I think that is why you have the most incredible verses in Yajur Veda and later on in Atharva Veda that speak about tolerance and that speak about having a respectful attitude towards foreigners, or for that matter for anybody. And you have this famous verse from the Yajur Veda which says Mitrasya Chakshisha Samiksha Mahe, which is that let us look upon everybody as a friend, because it is this bewildering diversity and difference that in one sense creates certain forms of religiosity in India. For instance, what I call them as zones of reconciliation. Pilgrimage, institution of pilgrimage being one of them. That's a zone of reconciliation where all castes and all differences melt. And of course, Rajiv spoke about Kumbh Mela. And then there are also other forms of, collective forms of religiosity like Kirtan, Katha, observing religious performances. This is another zone of reconciliation, as I see, where differences melt. And I think this is an important thing, because this then some kind of idea of unity, I mean, maybe at a very abstract sense, emerges from this. Now, in this book, the author clarifies the sources and ramifications of misperceptions in 5 chapters, and I don't want to dwell on those chapters because they've been very well discussed. I just want to reaffirm certain ideas which I think are crucial. The first idea is notion of dharma. And I want to go back to Manu, what Manu says about dharma. Now Manu in his Manu Smriti in chapter 2 talks about sources of dharma. And he says that there are 4 sources of dharma. You have Shruti, which is the Vedas. You have Smriti. You have Sadachar. Sadachar is the conduct of the virtuous. Then you have Shishtachar. Shishtachar is the conduct of the learned. And then he says, to my surprise, he says, if you don't believe in the dharma which is propounded by these four different groups, then Swasya Priyam Atmana, very simple resolution, whatever is dear to you. So I think this shows that dharma and many concepts in India it's an elastic term. And then when we follow the term and how it evolved in, let's say, in the Mahabharata, where and in the Bhagavad Gita was a great synthesis. It's an echo of several voices all sort of knitted together beautifully, where dharma becomes, there's notion of swadharma and there's notion of different streams of religiosity come together. So, and in the Mahabharata, it's very well stated in one of the passages that if there's a conflict, how do you know which is the best dharma to follow? And the answer is Desh, Kal and Patra. Again, it's relative to your location, spatial location, to the time when the question is posed, and Patra. It depends who's asking the question. So as Pavan Verma ji also spoke about the relativity of dharma. So relativity of dharma, and I think it's this relativity which is totally different. I mean, it's different in essence, I think, when we look at the Western model. So out of this, now another concept which I think is extremely important is the notion of kosha, that how is the self composed. So you have, for instance, this is an idea that goes back to the Upanishads, and where you have the kosha means 5 sheets, the self is composed of 5 sheets. We have the Annamaya kosh, which is the material sheet. Then you have the Pranmaya, the body of energy. Then you have Manomaya, that's cognitive body. And then that's Gyanmaya or Manomaya. And then you have Vigyanmaya. Now what does Vigyanmaya mean? It means that it's a level of consciousness where you apprehend truth intuitively. So Gyan and Vigyan, are 2 ways of knowing. And then of course finally you have, after that you have the body of bliss, Anandmaya. So what it actually means in operational terms, at any given moment, we can interact with the world on 5 different levels of consciousness. If you look at things materially, you'll get one answer. If you look at it energy, another, then mind, another, and then body of bliss is where there's total fusion and there's a tremendous experience of unity. So in India, we have these amazing concepts where you have notion of consciousness is discussed. Again, the notion of consciousness, like the notion of dharma, is also elastic. You can go on stretching it. And in fact, India has more words in Sanskrit on consciousness than any other culture of the world. So you have Paramatma and somewhere, then you just take, create a dictionary of it. It will run into several volumes, with different shades of meaning, tints and shades of meaning. So the idea of diversity is there at every level. Now, my aim was really not to, comment on the chapters in a detailed way. I just wanted to bring these 2-3 ideas together as affirmations. Now, the idea of integral unity is also indisputable, and from Veda down to the Agamas, you have innumerable concepts and images in Hindu tradition that speak about the notion of micro and macro correspondences and unities, and Vedas, as he rightly writes in his book, this notion of bandhutva, then the world being the body of God, and this is, it's just taken over, and there are hundreds of images. That is indisputable. Now the chapter on order and chaos, the author shows that apparently separate worlds or categories of biopolar oppositions are complementary and go together in the Indic worldview, and which is also something which is quite unique. Because, for instance, if we take the notion of male and female principles in the Agamas, the word which describes their sambandha, it's not just a sambandha that 2 things are asymmetrically related, but we hardly look at it in terms of our own persona, in that sense, because the idea of the self in India is linked with these mainstream concepts. So why is Rajiv into this discourse? Why is he putting all these differences together? Yeah, so I think it's really to remind us what you have just said, politics of knowledge. That's what I got for the book. So the images of Indic universalism appropriated by the West have a severe socio-political consequences. It is a necessary precondition for the justification and legitimization of hegemony of cultures of the West. Here the receiving subject, which is us, is portrayed as a mirror image or a near identical to the colonizer of knowledge. Inevitably, the observed subject is one who is pushed to be degraded and devalued. This tilts the power balance on the side of the opponent and establishes unconditional cultural hegemony of the West over the Eastern cultures. Now, it is not, I don't think I go into the socio-political implications of this, why it is happening, but it is happening, and those of us who are perceptive can easily vibe with this whole view. So, what does he suggest? This is another Sanskrit term, sarpeksha. He suggests that a direct mutual engagement with expectation of reciprocity and mutual respect. So basically, he's returning back to the principle of tolerance, which is referred to in the Yajurveda, and other texts. So you're really returning back to something which is perennial and which is in one sense is context-free value. I'm just going to end here. So basically, I found the work, it's a catalytic study, deeply provocative, that should be widely appreciated, and of course, strongly contested. Thank you very much.